and then I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to flip, again, if you're joining us for the first time, we usually flip back and forth between slides and live stuff. So it's not going to just be a slideshow. So I'll kick things off. So welcome again, our topic tonight. It's a big topic, troubleshooting WordPress. I know this is always a popular one because as much as we like WordPress, we talk about stability, there's always problems, you know, and it's not WordPress's fault, as we'll cover tonight. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, whether it's WordPress or any other type of content management system. So like I said, we have a lot that we'll cover. Here's what we're going to try to do in our agenda. We'll do some quick introductions, Peter and myself. Peter will set the context about identifying errors, just some general good advice around that. I'll dive into log files and what they are and what you could find in them. We'll cover some online debugging tools as well, so other things you can use to help point to your website and find out what's going wrong. We'll go back and forth a little bit on some plugins for debugging. There's tons of them out there, but we'll cover a few of them I think that are useful. And then we'll dive into some common problems that you're likely to run across if you're using WordPress for any period of time. So there's lots and lots of them. So we'll just try to cover some of the big ones you're likely to see. And then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. But as I said, we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for Q&A and certainly bring up questions as we're going along. So real quick about myself. My name's Ray. I'm, as I said, in Newington, Connecticut, in the Hartford area. I've been software developer for over 25 years. Worked for some large corporations. I've been using WordPress probably, I keep saying I could update the slides, probably 5 years-ish. I'm self-employed, so that's what I do for my business is build websites for small businesses and nonprofits using WordPress primarily. I'm married, no kids, one crazy cat who hopefully will be quiet tonight, and I'm a geek. Peter.
So I'm Peter Ingersoll. I live in South Windsor, Connecticut. I've been building websites since the beginning on various platforms and have found myself working in WordPress and really loving the community and the tool that we have. I've been working in WordPress for about 10 years. Yeah, this is what I do, probably too much, but there you go.
All right, so let's set a little bit of context. So you have slides for this? Or you want me to just keep up the?
No, I'll let me just bring up what I've got. So I will take ownership of the screen here, if that's okay by you.
Yep.
Because I'm also gonna go right into some of the what to look for on the admin side and all, if that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I just gotta grab the right screen. There we go. Share. See my identifying errors page here.
Yep.
Yeah, so when we look at the topic of what's the problem in WordPress, and I'll probably say this a few times throughout the evening, because having worked in WordPress for a number of years, let me tell you, it has gotten much better. The whole error handling process, especially I would say in the last year or so. And in fact, the number one thing that I've got on this list here that Ray and I from our history might talk about is the white screen of death. Isn't even really something that happens so much anymore. But that is, an identifying error, go to your website and it's like blank, or there's some message and nothing else. So obviously there's something wrong. So when we're looking at the types of errors that we're talking about this evening, we're looking at things like, there's something going wrong. It could be a big thing, it could be a small thing, it could be a small thing that looks like a big thing. But basically you're getting errors when you're visiting the site or errors when you're interacting with your site. You may go to your site and find an internal server error message, which is, a pretty serious thing. It basically means your server's not working, and I think Ray might get into some of those things a little bit more than me. Errors establishing a database connection. There's actually specific errors that you might get back when you read when you go to a site and go to your site or a WordPress site that's having some issues on the back end. And so the messages you're getting are going to give you a little bit more information. The connection timing out, the site just not responding. Then we get into alerts inside of WordPress itself, which is many of us are going to be quite familiar with. I think, when something happens and there's an alert at the top of the screen, or there's there's some kind of indication of, we've got a problem here. Then email notifications to the site admin are another thing that's also been a great improvement over the last year and a half, if I remember correctly. This idea that you can have a problem with your site, but it doesn't necessarily go down. Just something doesn't work. Visitors can still come to your site, but your site's going to go into a recovery mode. But you get an email as the admin that allows you to get that, and there'll be some messages in that email that you're going to want to look at and notice. To get clues of what's going on. Issues that are just come down to the site just doesn't look right, or what happened to all of my design and my style of the site. I'm seeing words, but things aren't loading properly, or the site is extremely slow. So all of these things are indicators that there's something going wrong. What I wanted to get into, because of things like, how those indicators work, are things like, what can you do to make sure that you're set up properly so that you are in the loop with your own website to make sure that, if there are issues, that you're on top of them versus, finding out, I've worked with clients who they didn't know that their site was down for a couple of weeks, just because they hadn't never gone there and they didn't have anything set up to tell them that there were any kind of issues. So, when I look at websites here, one of the things that you want to make sure when you're looking at your settings first, right? So I'm looking at settings and I'm saying, make sure that when you under general settings that your administration email is correct. Again, something that WordPress has improved is giving you a warning every once in a while when you log in that it says, hey, is this the right address? It's important to keep that address up, correct, because this is where, if there are any warnings, that WordPress is going to send some of those warnings. So that's pretty important. So, even checking for the correct site URL, like this right here, would technically be incorrect because the site URL is actually HTTPS. So I'm actually making the site go through a redirect because I haven't made sure that my URL is correct. So I'm gonna change that to now tell I've got to log in because I've been out for a little bit. But now it's saying, okay, now you're an HTTPS site. So just checking these aspects. Here's something under settings. So that's settings, general settings, reading. Sometimes people say, hey, I'm not logged into, I'm not getting indexed on Google. That's actually its own kind of error. If you want to be, check to make sure that search engine visibility is not checked here. Discourage search engines from indexing the site. So those are things to look for in the back end. Now, the Google will find your site and then say, oh, we can index it. If that's set to discourage, Google is going to respect that and not index your site. So there's a setting that affects how your site works. Permalinks too, that's under settings, is something to pay attention to. Permalinks here, a lot of people don't look at, but this is one where you set what the format of your URL is. And do you want to set it to just the post name or date or things like that? But there's something interesting about the permalink thing, and this is one of those troubleshooting, not sure why it works, but it works kind of thing. But every once in a while, the site will just not work right. And one of the troubleshooting tips is go into your permalinks. First of all, make sure that it's what you want, and then save them again. Saving your permalinks can reset things on your website's database to make things that weren't working work again. It's one of those weird little quirks, but when you have that kind in your toolkit of the types of things that you have available to you, the fact that the permalink and resaving them can actually sometimes fix your site. On the admin side of the in tools, you have site health, which is which is very handy. It's again relatively new tool. So you go to Tools, and then Site Health, and this is great. A great tool for telling you if there's an issue, if there's something going wrong, and then giving you some of the details that you can look at and get an idea. Especially if you're starting to look for some help, and somebody's saying, well, what version of PHP are you on? So under the Site Health, so Tools, Site Health, Info, then you get into all the details about what version you're on, all the different settings, directories, and sizes. You get some of the things that are set that might say, hey, how come I can't upload this file that's I don't know, 25 megabytes in size, and you might have a limit set, and you can go through all your settings. Like here under media handling, max size of uploaded file. In this particular case, it's 256 megabytes. But all of these, this is a great place where you can go and say, well, what is my site doing, and what are the settings and all. So a great handy tool. If you go to the status section, this is a place where, again, if there are some critical issues and all, you're going to see those notes here. Then you get kind of the recommended improvements and go, hey, you got to, your site has 22 inactive plugins. This is a sandbox website, and it's it's saying, hey, not a good idea. So using these tools are very valuable. And one other thing on the admin side is to, as simple as this is, check your users every once in a while. Make sure there's nobody in there that shouldn't be in there, especially under the admin. At the admin level, things can happen, and this can happen in a couple ways. One is, yes, you could get hacked. In other cases, and depending on the type of site you have, or if you've got employees or all, sometimes you have an employee in there that has access, and it's forgotten to remove them, and that's a potential problem that you don't want to have to troubleshoot when all of a sudden something breaks or something gets deleted or whatever because somebody who had access that shouldn't have got in there. So this is where kind of that setup is something that I think is important to pay attention to. Ray, anything else you want to add to this topic of identifying?
So real quick on site health, because we'll cover this as I get deeper into the logs and things. One of the reasons to look at things like site health is, even if you don't feel confident that you can resolve the problem of your broken website, let's say that you're contacting your hosting company, or let's say your website was developed by somebody else and you want to contact them, the more information you can provide to that next level support person, the better off. You don't have to go back and forth, and because when somebody contacts me with an issue, I'm generally like, well, what version of PHP are you on, et cetera, et cetera. So just gathering that information. In some themes, I know, like I'm thinking like Divi Elegant themes, they also have additional support information too, at the theme level. So, or a plugin they also have additional kind of system level information that you can pull. So just think about it that way, that even if you look at some of that stuff that Peter showed and it looks like gibberish to you, just knowing where you can get access to that and pull some of that information out to give to the person who really can understand it and help you out is very valuable.
Yeah, when you get into problems, and I think one of our goals here is just to not necessarily get you to know every last thing, but at least know kind of paths that you can go down. And when you have to, when it comes time to call your web hosting company, for example, this might be something you need to do. And I don't know if you saw when Ray was talking, even going in under info and go copy site info to clipboard, then you could paste it in an email. I paste it into it, but this is all of that information just output as a text file, which will help anyone else who's coming in and going, oh, I see that you are, and some piece of information here. So it's a built-in, very useful tool.
Totally agree.
All right, so we have the online tools, I think is you, Ray?
No, that's you. And we're flipping back to me for, I'll take it back. So I'm going to log files.
Yep, I'm sorry, I didn't have yours here. So can you take it, or I have to send it to you?
I can take it.
Great.
Can you see my screen?
Sure do.
All right, so this was Peter's thing, and this, you didn't use my great Don't panic. That's the big thing.
That's awesome.
Hitchhiker's Guide. Don't
Yep.
panic.
Don't panic.
I think it's a thing, you know, it's a thing too. Like when you're a beginner, I mean, we're there too. It's, you know, when something's not working, it really, it's stressful. You know, you're like, oh, is this thing ever going to work in general? Unless your site's been hacked. We're not talking about hacking things. Even there, you know, that's a whole separate thing. But in general, when there's a problem, you know, don't panic. Things aren't as bad as you know they may seem. So
yeah, and Ray, if I can add to that,
yep.
And I'm sure we'll talk about this when we start talking about, like, you know, resource where you can get information, and Facebook and some of the forums, ours and others. But where I see that some of the biggest problems is when somebody is panicking and then they start going down these paths that don't actually apply to what their problem is.
Yeah.
And then they get so far down rabbit holes that it becomes super panic, when it's just, you know, take a step back and let's really look and see, you know, should you be taking a step here or there. So it's really important not to go. I've had sites that have look like they totally exploded, and just looking at it and 1 minute later going, it's this, click, done, you know.
Exactly. So a layer deeper, you know, so Peter talked about site info, which is a great place to start, because that'll give you the general idea. And you may see some issues in there too. Sometimes WordPress site info will tell you if something's wrong. Sometimes it's a little bit misleading too, because sometimes there's things in there that are more recommendations or warnings, and there's some that you can even ignore. But so let's say that you've now identified you are having a problem, you know, because things don't look right, you know, whatever. So where do you go to get that next level of detail? And that's where log files come in. So I guess I'll make this bigger. I'll make this bigger for now. So this is a real simplified picture. I grabbed you can see the link for it below. But just, you know, at a high level, whether it's WordPress or it's Squarespace or whatever, I mean, all websites are basically, you know, architected the same kind of way. So, you know, you have you or somebody, you know, at your computer using a browser, Chrome or whatever you're using, and that front end is really speaking to a back end, which is made up of a lot of different components. So WordPress itself is, you know, an application. It's a content management system. It's basically an application or, you know, code that's running on a server someplace. And this is a highly simplified picture too. You know, meanwhile, you can go through content delivery networks and all that. Forget about that for a minute. But, you know, so WordPress itself is one component of this bigger piece on the back end. And so WordPress is then running on what's called a web server. You know, so web server in general is something like Apache or Nginx or whatever. And those servers are, you know, they're reading file systems. They're also reading databases. You know, from a WordPress standpoint, the database typically is MySQL. So all of these components, just think about this in terms of, there's a lot of moving parts. So each one of these moving parts could be the problem. And from a log file perspective, each one of these parts may or may not, in general, have its own error logging thing that you can then dig into. So, you know, as you're looking at a problem, one of the key things is isolating where is that problem happening. So I'm going to show each of these layers a little bit, you know, where you can find the log files for them. So as I said, there's server logs we'll talk about in a second. WordPress itself has logs. We won't go into database logs or security logs in this presentation. Those are their own kind of deep topics. And once you get into database logs, at that point, you really want to call in some experts on that. Even security logs too. That's things are going quite bad when you're at that level. And then we'll show you browser logs. But in general, I'd say, you know, the majority of the time, if you're looking at your server logs, WordPress logs, or browser logs, you can start to pinpoint where you're having a problem. So let's talk about server logs. So again, you know, depending on your hosting company, so a lot of my sites are still on SiteGround. I've worked on sites on Bluehost, GoDaddy, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those hosting companies does have, you know, your site is running on a server, like I said, Apache or Nginx, whatever. But what you can see, whether you have access to those server logs or not, really depends on your hosting company. In the past, you know, there was a tool called cPanel. So if you're using Bluehost or HostGator or one of those other ones, you still have cPanel. cPanel is kind of going away, it seems like, for various reasons. So a lot of companies like Flywheel or SiteGround, they're now using, like, it's more managed hosting, or they're using a client area. So they're hiding all the ugly details of cPanel, and they're putting things into their own version of a user interface. But usually, even if you're using that kind of a hosting service, you should still have a place where you can see server logs there. So you may have to ask your hosting company, where can I find the server logs? Worst comes to worst, you can always find your server logs through FTP or file manager. So most hosting companies will still give you some sort of file level access. So when we talk about server logs, I'm specifically referring to PHP. So PHP is like the language that WordPress itself is using to build your web pages. And then the web server logs. The web server logs you're most likely not going to want to peek into too much. That's more outside your control. Even if you find something there, there's not much you can do about it because your hosting company really is responsible for that. But PHP logs, these are probably the ones that you're most likely want to take a peek at some point if there's a server issue going on. So as I said, depending on your hosting company, you can either turn on, one thing you want to make sure is, are you logging? Most hosting that I've run into, and again, I've used a lot of different hosting companies, most of them have logging turned on by default because they want to know if there's an issue going on. But you want to just double check. If you're not finding these logs, you want to double check and make sure that PHP logging is turned on. So if you have cPanel, if you still have cPanel in general, again, you search your hosting company's instructions, but you'll typically find what's called like a PHP ini editor, and in there you can put a setting on to turn on logging. Or if you're using a hosting company like this one, I forget where I got this one from. You can turn on or off logging. So a lot of times you'll see it as a switch in some place. It could be turned on and off. And these PHP errors, these are typically saved in, the name may vary, but typically I see them as error_log, and it'll be in the root directory of your website. So if you remember, your website typically is in a home directory someplace, then WordPress is underneath that. These error logs are typically at your home directory level, unless somebody's changed the location. So what do you see? All right, now if you found it, so what's in it? Where I've seen a need to look into these PHP logs more recently is because of PHP 7 upgrades. So for people who may not know, WordPress in the past used to run on all old versions of PHP, PHP 5, et cetera, et cetera. And over the past year or so, maybe a little bit longer, WordPress itself has been raising the bar, the minimum level of PHP that's required to run your website. So a lot of people are finding that old websites or old themes are breaking because they have conflicts. Some plugin or your theme itself may have a function call that, some PHP function call that no longer exists. It's been eliminated. So here's an example of one. This is a real life example recently for a client I worked on. So she had an old version of all-in-one event calendar. Hadn't been updated in forever, and sure enough, this function, is no longer used anymore. So this was showing up inside the PHP log. So this was actually preventing us from upgrading to PHP 7.4, whatever that version is. So these error logs, when you look at them, and let me jump out for a second. I cut out a nice slice of one, but when you look at these things, they can be a little intimidating at first because this is what they could look like. Oh, a ton of information in here. And in fact, depending on the age of your site, I mean, this site's the one I'm showing here has been around for probably 8 years or so. You may have error messages in here that go back for years. So, rule of thumb, first off, expect a big file if your site's been around for a while, and always start at the bottom. So if you go to the bottom of these things, I won't scroll all the way down there, but you can see it's going down by date. But in general, once you find a particular error, and you always want to find the most current one for the date that you're looking at these things, you will find some information that will help you cut through the gibberish. So in general, there'll be a line number, and here's the most important thing. You should find an indicator what component is causing that error. So I think Peter will probably talk a little bit later about, for plugins are one of the most notorious suspects for breaking things. So, it kind of starts with figuring out which plugin is broken. So this is a good way. If you look at the error log, you can figure out, okay, here's the one that's causing my issue. Just again, real quick aside that in all of these logs, it's one of those things like you're going to find a lot of noise in there too. So that's kind of something you learn over time that, you may see something that's really not an error. It's a warning or an informational message that you may ignore. So don't go down, a wrong path by chasing something that maybe really isn't an error. So that's PHP. That's probably one of the places where I would look at these if you're having an issue, especially upgrading, or if you know that your host, has just upgraded you to 7.4 and things aren't working or things are breaking. You may want to take a look at the PHP error logs. The other kind of also common place to get logging is WordPress itself. So WordPress has the ability to turn logging on. So there's a debug setting in WordPress where you can turn on logging or not. And again, depending on your host, some hosts are nice, like Insta. There's a couple others I've seen where they just have a switch. You can go to your website, dashboard in your hosting company and turn debugging on and off kind of quickly. So that's the safest way, or if you're not really comfortable updating your WordPress configuration file, that's the quickest way to do it. There's also plugins out there that will let you do this. I'll show one a little bit later called WP debugging, where you install that. You can turn it on and off, or you can manually edit it. And it's really not that hard. I know some people, like I said, get intimidated by this, but if you edit your WP config, it's just turning a couple lines on. So just talking through these quickly. First one is by default, WordPress debugging is turned off. So this is, one of these caveats too for any of these things. When you're turning debugging on or logging on, just be careful, because as you saw, you can really fill up a log file pretty quickly. So if you're trying to research a problem, it's fine to turn debugging on, but just make sure when you're done researching, turn it off. There is a performance cost to debugging a lot of times, including disk space, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so if you're debugging in WordPress, you turn this setting on, and by default, WordPress will actually show these errors on the browser. So if you're running a live site, you don't want that. You don't want people signing onto your site seeing all this gibberish error messages on your live site. So you want to log it someplace. So by default, I think by default, it writes it to a debug log file in your WP content directory. So that's where you would be able to see it. And that file, I think it's called debug.log. So remember, the PHP one's error log. This one's debug log. So here's kind of what it looks like. Here's an example of what you would find in there. So you'll find errors that are, again, now you're focusing more on the WordPress space of the application. So errors and warnings from your plugins, themes, WordPress core. You're probably not likely to see a lot from WordPress core in there, but that's where you would see errors written. Again, another recent thing with WordPress, since WordPress 5.5, I think, or 6, I forget which, maybe it was 5.6. I got it right here. WordPress actually eliminated a library for jQuery. So jQuery is a JavaScript library that's been around forever, but there's things in it that haven't been updated in quite a while. So now some plugins, especially older ones that haven't been updated, are having conflicts because they were missing this library, or they're just like the PHP thing, they were calling functions that don't exist. So I have an example in here, very similar to what we saw with the PHP error log. In general, you will get some information logged in there that can help you pinpoint what's broken. So in this case, my favorite divvy over here is Elegant Themes Builder. So this is an actual error from a child theme that I'm using, where the child theme was overriding a Divi function that Divi no longer supports. So that's, always be careful when you're creating child themes of, don't rely on your parent theme necessarily to, not change over time. Things can change. So this information can help you pinpoint what's the problem. You may not be able to dive in here. I mean, you literally can dive into code if you're comfortable and find the line number. But in general, this goes back to gathering these bits of evidence so that when you do talk to somebody, let's say you contacted your theme support, you open up a ticket or something, this is great information to send them and say, hey, I'm having a problem. Here's what I found in my WordPress log. I'll pause there for a second. These make sense. These are the last of the server side things that I was going to talk about.
Ray, do you think you could maybe mention about PHP info? I know it's a lot less used now probably than it, since the site info is in the dashboard, but PHP info has gotten me out of trouble any number of times, or just informative when you're setting up a site.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it, like I said, even it's gathering as much information as you can about your setup. The other piece I didn't show here too is for some hosting, and some of it's hidden now for you as well, but older hosting too, like I'm thinking HostGator is a site I worked on recently. Even looking at the server level information, you may find things in there that could be red flags. For example, a directory that's full or high CPU utilization. Sometimes that's another piece of information that you can look at as well. So, one thing I've learned with debugging, and other people I assume will agree with this too, is sometimes also be careful, don't go down to, gathering too much information. It's easy to get lost in the weeds of debugging. It's like, try to focus on your current problem and don't chase other shiny objects while you're doing that. So just one last thing, and I'll hand it back to Peter. So, so a lot of problems you can find, or you can only find, I should say, on the server side, but looking at server side logs. But on the client side, back to your browser itself, and Steve and I were looking at this a little bit earlier before people joined, is your browser itself has logging. So if you're using a modern browser, which again, these days, I think everything's a modern browser, but I happen to use Chrome the most. So use a browser. Safari has this as well, Firefox, with good developer tools. So, if you're using Chrome, you can see your developer tools by either going through this, view developer, et cetera, or if you just right click on an element, it'll launch the developer tools. So let me just, you can't go to Google. If I go to let me go to my demo site for a second. Demo. I know we did a whole discussion on this, but if you haven't done inspect before.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. So if I right click on something here, inspect it, boom, these are the developer tools. And specifically from a logging perspective, the two that I'll call out here is the network log and the console log. So the network log is really, it's a good thing to look at in terms of HTTP errors. So we'll cover a couple of the common ones a little bit later, but these are the errors that are more around the communication between your browser and a website. So if something isn't looking right, or things are slow, et cetera, that's the network logs, the place you want to go and look at these. And I'll just give a real quick peek here. But so for example, if I refresh the screen, all of these errors, so a 200.
Yeah, I got a package today.
So
I got a package today.
So 200, sorry, Bill, 200 is good status. That means everything's okay. But you can also sort. If you're having problems, you can sort and see what's going on. So 307s, for example, et cetera. Some of these are redirects. Maybe if you're covering redirects later or not, Peter, but not everything's an error in terms of fatal. Some things are just more of, you should fix it, but it's not, the end of the world. So network log, that's one place to look for things like response codes. The console log is one that you also want to take a peek at. So if you're having a problem with a website, the console log is where you'll see more runtime information. And these days, especially as more and more websites are now, even WordPress, more and more websites are not just HTML and PHP. More of what you see is actually JavaScript. So when JavaScript is failing, you're not going to find that error on their server logs. That's failing on your side of things. So the data has come down and now something is broken. So that's where you want to start looking at this other console. So let me just show you this again. So this console, and again, here's another good rule of thumb. When you're debugging something, always start off with a nice clear console. So you hit that clear button and then reload a page. So the page is having a problem. So you can see there's a whole bunch of gibberish in here. So this is where errors are being written. So these are client side errors. So again, it may be overwhelming if there's too much in here, but sometimes looking at this, you'll get a clue for what's going on. You'll see something in here that pinpoints, oh, it's a JavaScript function that's failing. Or, one thing I run into a lot too is when I'm doing testing, I've got a lot of ad blockers running on my browser. I kind of forget sometimes that'll really screw things up, because sometimes, YouTube scripts won't load and other things. And you're looking at a site and you're like, something doesn't look right. It's like, oh, shut off my ad blocker, and then reload the site, and voila, those things are loading normally again. So keep in mind any browser extensions. If you're a guy like me with a bunch of different tools in your browser, those can also screw things up sometimes, because they're manipulating your HTML. So sometimes it's not the website that's broken; it could be an extension that's broken instead. So again, different places to look for errors, logs, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on what's broken, you may have to go to several of these and piece together, different bits of information. All right, so online debugging tools. I'm going to hand that's going over to you, Peter.
All right, so let me share that same screen. There we go. So I use a lot of tools, online tools, when I suspect there's something going on with a website. Everything gives me clues. Some things will give me specific answers. The list is really long. Many of us have our own favorites. Often someone will bring up something I've never heard of and vice versa. So this particular list that I'm talking about in terms of some of the online tools you can use for troubleshooting isn't really in any particular order, nor is it meant to be fully comprehensive. It's the types of things that we find. And I'm thinking, Ray, that maybe one of the things we do is we create, I don't know if you noticed, but this website is hartfordwp.com that I think I'd like to, build out with you, Ray, on things to help the group, but putting some of these things out in these links. So I pulled together some that I tend to go to. One of the new ones that I found relatively new is the Google Page Experience Checker. So in troubleshooting, a big topic that often comes up is not about why the site, it's not about the site is broken. It's about the site is not optimal. Something isn't working. In some cases, the site works, but really slowly for some reason. And this is a neat site that makes, and there's new factors coming up that the page speed results. But this is a great little site for, and I'll put in a site that I'm involved while I'm talking. But what this one does is it runs some online tests. Again, is going to give you some clues as to some things that may be working for you or not working for you. Hopefully it will return quick enough. If not, I'll come back to it. But the idea is that there are certain factors that affect how well your site is working on the web. And in fact, that experience of how a site works is what Google is going to use for ranking. So I look at that as in the area of the things that you want to pay attention to in terms of hey, I've got to troubleshoot something. And this will give you some kind of neat tools, and also look into some of the topics in a nice way about, and we'll talk a little bit later about what's considered unsafe content. But this one tool is telling us, okay, hey, you're setting up a secure site. There's no unsafe content. You're mobile friendly, and then it gives you some of these results in terms of the speed of the site and how quickly it responds and all. And all of these are going to be factors measuring in. And this might tell you, for example, that give you some ideas that you've got something on your site if you're getting lower scores here. And I'm not somebody to be, pay attention to, getting 100% on everything. These are all indicators. But when you see you might have a slow performance on a server, that might be something you want to look into, is to figure out why. So there's, indicators to pay attention to. Very similarly, GT metrics is one that I use as a way. It takes a little bit, but this is a place that you can go, put in your URL, and it's going to give you, again, more measurement tools, give you an idea of, whether you are ranking well or not on certain topics. Again, people get really caught up in the grades of things. One of the things that I look at here is what Ray was showing in the inspector with the network. It's the waterfall. It kind of tells you every time that there is a, when it goes out and tries to pull your CSS file or your HTML or your images, and how long does it take for each thing to load and all. So this is GT metrics is a very, very popular tool for really looking at the performance of your site. ViewDNS is a site that I use, and this might be something that if somebody says, well, what's the IP address of, or what, is your DNS set up properly? And this is a neat tool because all on one page, it shows a lot of information. These are all separate tests that you would put in. Like if I were to look up Hartford WP, which I set up this afternoon, and right now I'm just looking at the DNS propagation checker, and it's going to go out and it's going to look to see. Now, say you had to change something with your servers, you're going, hey, how come my site's not, using the right IP address? This tool will tell you, if you've got some issues. So, the fact that all name servers. What's that?
I was going to throw in real quick. The DNS one too, where I've seen that useful is between launching a new site, a lot of times where you're waiting for things to come up, or
Exactly.
if you're adding something to your DNS settings, let's say you're doing a verification for Google or Mailchimp, whatever, they have you put in something in your text. You have to add a setting in there,
Yep.
And you're sitting there going, "What's going on? What's wrong?" It's these kind of these DNS checkers are good for that. So
and
just be patient.
Yeah, exactly. So this one is a great tool that I often go to when I'm doing a site audit and I'm checking to see, some of the details, these have some meaning to me. I use Hover as my registrar of choice, for example, and that's the IP address of the website and so on. So View DNS is a great tool that I use very, very often. Sometimes when I think that if there's an issue with the site that it may have been hacked, this particular website is a free online website malware scanner. It happens to be one that I found that finds things that some of the other ones don't. So it's kind of on my list in case I start thinking that, oh, what's going on? Maybe this website was hacked. Why no padlock? This is one that we use, and I'll talk a little bit more about it specifically, but that the whole issue of, is your SSL certificate set up properly? Why, when you go to Google, does it say that your website is not secure, or there's a link and it says, oh, be careful, this site's not secure? And you might say, well, wait a minute, I have a secure website. And it's like, well, maybe you're not getting, the padlock up here, or there's something reason. And if you run your website through Why No Padlock, you'll get a list that might say, oh, everything's looking good except for you've got a bunch of images that are only using HTTP instead of HTTPS, and therefore you have mixed content, and therefore you might not get your site might not be considered secure. MX Toolbox is a site that I use when I'm debugging a problem with emails, and that could be its own 2-hour topic, right? The whole, email and WordPress. But one of the things to look for too, it sometimes comes up where if your site or your domain, for example, gets, I'm gonna put in the whole thing, of course. Maybe it's been blacklisted. Maybe there's some issues with, the way your site is set up on the name servers. And this is yet another tool that's going to be able to give you some information about your domain in the world of email. And there's a number of tools. If you click down here, it's kind of like the View DNS, but there are a number of tools here that I might come to and need, because I'm like, something's not working, something's not connecting. And this is a nice little package. And that blacklist check is something that you sometimes go and you go, oh, wait a minute, why am I, all of a sudden I'm getting some red? Maybe you're on a server that somebody else, maybe you did something naughty, sent out bulk emails under your email address that you shouldn't have, or, somebody on the same server. So this is a great tool for looking at something like that. It's in my toolkit. Broken link checker, and we'll talk about another tool for this, but this is an online tool. Sometimes you just, hey, something's not working and you've got a broken link. Screaming Frog is a favorite for doing that with a piece of software on your desktop. I think it's 500 URLs for free. So if you've got a relatively small website, this will check to see if you have any broken links within your website. That's both internal and external. As your site grows, you may find that there's issues with what you link to, or it's an easy way to go through and go, oh, wait a minute, some image I was using isn't working now. I found, for example, broken, I'll talk about it briefly later too, but all of a sudden you've got an image that's no longer there, and it may be that you thought you had it on your site, but you were actually linking to an external site. That can happen. It could even be an external development site. I've seen that happen any number of times when sites get moved. So checking how things are linking on the back end is pretty important. Screenfly is a great little thing, a great tool that I did not put in. I did not change that link. So let me go to Screenfly. Screenfly is a great tool for testing what your site looks like on various browsers. So if I put in this particular website, where this comes in handy is, again, when people start, they might say, hey, your site just doesn't look good on my device, for example. Maybe it's something that you don't have. I think I have to put in the full URL. Let me go to, so I'm just using this site as an example, but this is a site that looks like this on my screen. If I go to Screenfly and I put in that URL, it's going to show, oh, that's what your site. So it's an external way too to have your site be looked at by another server and tell you what it looks like, because we can get caught up in, you may be looking at something on your screen that that the rest of the world is not seeing. So this is a neat way of looking at your site through what does it look like on an iPad Pro? What does it look like on an iPhone 6, I guess, and then you get an idea of how your responsive, the responsiveness of your site is working. So I like Screenfly as a way of just kind of taking a look at a website through different eyes, especially if I'm getting kind of some feeling that there are some issues with the site that I might not be seeing, but other people are. Uptime Robot is something. It's not necessarily it's a proactive way to see when your site goes down. And you can set this up for free and use this website to ping your site on a regular basis and then send you a text or an email when your site goes down, and then you can go through and all the troubleshooting. But it's a nice tool to put in your toolkit and to again have a way of checking your site pretty regularly. Well, every 5 minutes, I believe, is still in the free version. And there's many more. When I go up to my bookmarks and I go under testing, I've got any number of things that I might look at based on the problem that I might be running into. Ray, do any stand out? Are there any that you use that I didn't mention?
You covered a lot of them. I want to say for uptime, I don't use Uptime Robot, but for some clients, I'm using Managed WP, like an uptime checker. And one thing I've learned too is that you also don't expect your site to be up 100% of the time.
Correct.
Because your host is, things are happening. Your host is doing things, so don't freak out. So I've had
don't panic.
Don't panic. I've had to adjust for clients to say, okay, if it's down, wait a minute or two. You can adjust the thresholds a lot of times, so you don't freak people out by saying your site was only up 98%. Well, for a website, that's again, we're not talking about sending airplanes out or whatever. 98% uptime for a website is fine.
Right.
So
right.
I like this. I mean, the nice thing about this list, I think this goes back to, there's nothing in here that I can recall that's specifically WordPress related. But
Right.
It's back to WordPress itself. It's a website. All these tools will work for any kind of website, whether WordPress or not. So that's the thing. Sometimes people get a little too focused on only looking for things WordPress related. But as you start to look at websites in general, it's like these things will work for anything. So,
yeah, exactly. There are a few WordPress specific tools. I often use that WP theme detector site when I'm looking at websites, but that's not really a troubleshooting tool.
Yeah.
That's sort of an under the hood tool. So yeah. Now, when we get into things like plugins, again, the list is huge, and there's a lot of things that you can use, but there are certainly things that I think rise to the top. I don't think we don't really have the time to go through all of them in detail, other than just to kind of give you an idea, what they do. So. And Ray, please jump in if you use or like any of these, so the debug bar is giving you information while
I'm
you're
actually covering the WP query one. I think I cover that in my slides too. I forgot to
Right.
show
Yeah.
that. So yeah.
Query is a WP query or query monitor,
Yeah. Yeah.
where this is telling you, this is a plugin. Again, Ray will spend time on it, that tells you what's going on as it's going on. Sometimes there are issues with something is or isn't working. So the cron manager, and I actually think you have more experience with the cron manager, similar to the WP control, which again is telling you what's going on. The cron system is the thing that, how to best describe it. Like if you've got emails queued up and it's going to send them out, or
For backups. Remember, I think somebody on our Facebook group, that was a problem where they were
Yes.
asking about that. I'm not sure if she's on this call or not, but she was having an issue where her backups, nightly backups were failing, and she had a plugin, I think it was Duplicator or whatever it was. And it was failing because the cron job wasn't, there were a bunch of them were backed up. And after a while, her host, it says, these things aren't completing, so they're all paused. So she had to go in there, I think, and clear them out and let them run again. And that's how you fix it.
Yeah, exactly. And and as I'm scrolling down, like one I didn't have, but I've used like user switching. User switching is a really nice little plugin for if you're supporting a website and you have users at different, like an editor or a contributor, or and you need to see it from their perspective. This is a great tool for troubleshooting, debugging, going through the site as if you were somebody else, and in a quick, easy way. So we can, like I said, we can keep growing that list. So simple history is something that I like. What's that?
I want to see this one caught my eye because this is the ones I think people ask for quite often.
Yeah, so this one I like a lot. And what it does, I don't know. Let me see if I activated it on here. Let me activate it if I haven't. This is just my sandbox site. So if you go to, this is activated on the site, and in simple history is showing 27 events today from one user and one other source. This is on my sandbox site, and it's literally listing everything out in a way that you can kind of get an idea of who did what. It's a great tool. I think it is. It's funny when it's right under here, under the dashboard, so you can go right to simple history.
That's nice.
And kind of get a look at lots of little things that I changed. You could tell that 7 hours ago I updated the time zone to New York. This is a great tool for seeing what's going on. Automatic things that happen automatically, like automatic updates, will be here. The one caveat with simple history is it is writing to your database, and you can set how much you want to hold in your database. Like a 30-day right now, it's keeping 30 days and then deletes, or you can go in but to me it's like I manage a couple of sites with people, and all of a sudden if something goes wrong, I can go into simple history and kind of get a look at and say, oh, I see you were playing with plugins when you shouldn't have been. So this is a great little thing. I don't know, any questions specifically on this, Ray? Have you used this one?
I've seen something similar to it. Eric in the chat also put another one there. I forget which one I saw, but it's very useful on sites where you have multiple editors and things going on there, because that's where I forget which one I looked at, but it was somebody said, oh, I didn't do such a thing. And then went back to the logs, and you pull it out. You say, well, yeah, in fact you did. Oh, I didn't realize I did that. Well, okay.
Well, if you have bigger sites, I think it's blog vaults, that now you can get into, maybe it's not, I know this is the backup, but also tied into some of these tools. You can get premium versions that don't write to your database, write to the cloud, write to their database. So there are, but you're paying, but it's a great way to, if you're really maintaining it, you want to keep that history for a long time and really look at it. And in a history that takes a lot of what you might have in your log files, but in a digestible way, if and then even filterable and things like that. Health check and troubleshooting is a neat one. It is by the WordPress.org community, so it's coming out of WordPress.org. It's kind of interesting like the binary world that we live in. It's either 5-star or 1-star kind of thing. But what health check troubleshooting does is if I go back here, I want to make sure it's active. So it's not active here, but if I come to this site, this sandbox site, and I go to what I already showed under tools, site health, I'll open this in a new tab. We talked about this a little bit earlier. If I activate this health check and troubleshooting, it really does something kind of neat. Come over here, refresh this, and oh, did I activate it? There we go. So it has its own, I was looking at the same site health. It has its own kind of version of site health where now you have troubleshooting and tools has been added to your status and info. And troubleshooting, if you enable troubleshooting mode, your website becomes still visible to the external. All right, so if I am looking at this in an incognito window, this sandbox website still works, but on the back end, now I'm in troubleshooting mode. You can disable. You can go through all the process of enabling and disabling plugins. See, they're showing them all disabled, even though on the front end the site is working. So it's a tool. I'm not sure I would debug an entire website in this mode, but if you need to do some quick checking without touching the front end and plus getting additional tools, this health check tool gives you this ability to debug your site while not affecting the front end to the end users. Now, and it's telling you, any changes that you make to settings will be kept when you disable troubleshooting mode. So you're troubleshooting to test, and it's almost like a pseudo staging site, if you will. The problem is when you disable it, you're pushing it live. So you're basically making sure that your website works as it is. If I visit that same site on my side as admin, now I'm seeing what this site looks like without any of those plugins enabled. So this, as I start reactivating them, these things will start working. It's interesting because you can see how the theme and the CSS is not working. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Have you ever used this one, Ray, or anyone else on the call?
No, I think I saw it before, but when I looked at it, it to me seemed, I never saw that part of it. Some of it seemed redundant to what they have with site health. Because I think this one's been around longer. From my understanding, I thought some of the history was some of this functionality is basically what got turned into the site health thing. So
the same group that worked on site health have further developed and have this kind of more robust version of the site health. So it is in fact the same group. One of the other things that's kind of interesting is when you have it activated, if you go into your plugins, you're getting choices to do things with enable while troubleshooting, disable while troubleshooting, and also you're going to get a number of things that happen. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just know, especially for the advanced users, that this tool allows you to do a lot more with that whole site health check aspect of your site. Now that I'm out of disable, you can see under my plugins, I actually have a troubleshoot mode tied to it in case I want to go in there and see what's going on. But anyway, without spending too much time, probably already spent too much time. I think that's a really neat, neat tool. Broken link checker. It's a way of doing internal broken links as a plugin. I believe this one's had some problems recently where I think this one had a security issue, and two, it takes a bunch of resources. So this would be one that I would use as like a activate it, check your site, deactivate it. I wouldn't be someone to have it keep live on it. A WP rollback is something we've talked about before, which is gives you the opportunity to roll back, go back to a previous version of a plugin or a theme if you have some problems with something after you go through and update a plugin. So that's a nice plugin for that. Check and log email. I put it here just because it's a tool that will tell you what's going on with your email, especially if you're using your web host, your website as your email sender, which we don't recommend that you do, but many of us do for various reasons. But it's the idea, like if you're saying, hey, the email's not going through, if you activate this plugin, you'll get a log of specifically to emails what's happening. So it's a nice way of being able to specifically check what's happening with email. The WP file manager can be handy if there's certain specific things that you want to do and you don't want to open up your FTP client, but it might be specifically file related. So it just gives you a WordPress backend way of managing or looking at your files on your web server through this tool. Like anything, proceed carefully, because obviously you don't want to mess files up that you don't want to mess up. But it is a web-based file manager to your website. And I think like WP data access, we talked about not getting too deeply into some of the data issues, but there are plugins that allow you to go in and kind of look at some of the specifics of your database should you need to do that, especially for the more advanced users. I know we're not really touching a lot on the database thing, but this is a pretty powerful plugin. Anything else you want to add to this list, Ray?
No, I have a couple to add on my slides. So
okay, great.
Just real quick too. Like I said, that's a thing too. And with plugins, we're going to share obviously our slides afterwards too, and we're going to give access to what Peter was showing. It's one of those things, just knowing that debugging tools exist out there. I mean, that's the key thing. So you obviously don't want to install all these, use them all on your site. Don't do that. It's back to knowing that there's a right tool out there for the type of problem you're debugging. And it sort of goes back to, the logging and the admin things. It's pinpointing where to look next. So some of these tools will help you get that next layer of information, and then you may not be able to still resolve the problem, but the more info you're gathering, the more people can help you out, hopefully, to resolve the root cause. So just a couple quick ones. I think we already talked. So jQuery migrate helper. This goes back to, as I mentioned earlier, that issue with once jQuery got updated, or I'm sorry, once the library got removed with WordPress. If you're using old plugins or old themes that are still calling old jQuery functions, the nice thing is jQuery migrate helper, it'll show you specifically, which plugins, which modules are having problems. So in this case, it was, some old plugins and some old themes. So again, probably not a lot you can do, likely, unless you're a coder, to go in here to fix these things. But this just may be, something to pinpoint to say, hey, I need to get off of this theme, or I need to update this plugin, or et cetera. So that's a helpful one. WP debugging, I mentioned this one briefly too. So if you're not comfortable messing around with the WP config file, this is a nice one you can install quickly and turn debugging on for WordPress. This is the WordPress debugging, and it has a tool where you can view the log file directly from the backend admin piece. So that's another nice one. Again, just like I said earlier, WordPress debugging, make sure you turn it off once you're done resolving things. You don't want to slow your site down. Peter talked about this quickly, the query monitor. This is much more advanced. I'd say most people probably won't be looking at this. I had to use this extensively once for a client where it was a kind of a homegrown theme that somebody wrote, and especially they were using custom post types and all this other kind of stuff. So some of the query logic that somebody else wrote was slowing the site down. So that's where a thing like this was kind of helpful to pinpoint that. All right, so now, plugins, tons of plugins out there. And for the sake of time, we're going to cover some common problems. And Peter, if that's okay, I'll go first because I'm sharing the slides, and I'll hand it back to you. this is probably we're gonna run out of time here. So we're gonna cover as much stuff as we can. We'll probably pause after a couple of these and let folks jump in with problems that they've seen and maybe came here tonight to help get resolved. So I'll talk real quick about very common ones, and it's kind of the nebulous ones are these HTTP errors. And I grabbed this picture from Kinsta, I believe, as well. So just real quick, if you're not a nerd into this, but you know what happens behind the scenes when you are accessing a website, you know, your browser, and we saw this when I looked at Chrome, that networking thing, your browser is making a request to a server someplace. So that's your HTTP request. And then you get a response back. And generally the response, when all is going well, you know, that includes a status code of like 200 is a good one. So 200, everything's great. And then your data for your website, et cetera, comes back in the rest of the response. So it's these status codes. These are the ones that when something is wrong, that's really what's happening. It's your servers telling you there's some kind of issue going on. So some very common ones that you'll see, kind of the dreaded, the 500 is basically your site's unresponsive. You know, this might be one related to the white screen of death or not. But typically when you see an internal server error, typically that's a hosting. Something's happening on the hosting side of things. It could be a browser caching issue. I mean, you could try really quickly clear your browser cache because maybe something's going on. I've seen this before. I've caused this for my own problems where if I'm launching a site and I'm impatient or if I'm doing something else where this actually that's a 503, but I've seen this where I've caused it on my own. Actually, I think the PHP upgrade I did caused the internal server error. There we go. So that's what I said here. So maybe related to PHP upgrade. So one thing you can quickly try to do is if you're the one who did the PHP upgrade to 7.4, try downgrading and see if that gets rid of the problem temporarily. But this is one where this is where you want to go look at those server logs, because typically there will be something on the server side that will tell you exactly what caused this error. The other one is more the temporary. So this is the 503, service unavailable. I've seen this one happen where if backups are running, if you're doing a plugin update, sometimes just your site is temporarily unavailable. So it's typically some kind of process is running. And this may just be internet traffic, other things going on. So this one, try again. Generally 9 times out of 10, well, 8 times out of 10 maybe, it's a temporary thing. So take a look, try it again. But sometimes if this keeps happening, this could be a sign where you do need to go to your server statistics or your server side and look at things like CPU. Maybe you're running on a hosting. I ran into this recently with a client where they're running 2 websites on the same hosting environment because one was an old HTML site and one's a WordPress site. And these things are starting to eat up resources as their traffic grew. So it was time to split these things apart a bit. For each one of these 2, there's so many other things you can try. Like I said, we'll send you the slides. There's plenty of other details behind the 2 of these, and Kinsta, I know Peter likes them as well too. Their blogs are excellent for resources. I'll touch upon, I'll go through these kind of quickly too. So some WordPress specific ones, some very common ones I think that you may encounter. One is the dreaded memory limit error. So this again is caused because your hosting provider has set a limit in terms of how much memory is going to be allocated to WordPress itself. So depending on your hosting, whether it's shared or not, or your level of hosting, sometimes that level of memory could be quite low. So, ideally you say, all right, let me just bump up the memory. Well, sometimes you can, sometimes your hosting company won't let you. If you're in a managed WordPress environment in particular, they control a lot of these settings, so you can't get in there and do this. But if you do have control over it, it is a fairly simple fix. If you're comfortable, again, in the WP config, you can change the memory limit. Again, there's limits, like you can't bump this up to an infinite number because, your hosting company eventually say, all right, well, they'll give you a limit there. So here's the one kind of error you may see with this on your logs, something like this, memory size exhausted. This typically that's an indicator that your WordPress installation itself has something has happened. It could be a plugin, it could be your theme, etc. You've run out of memory allocated. Another real quick one too, from a size standpoint, maximum upload file size. I've seen this quite often, depending on what you're uploading. So it could be images. Hopefully you don't have an image that's that gigantic, but depending on your hosting company, your file size limit may be quite small. I worked on a site not too long ago where it was like 64 megs, which sounds big enough, or at least it did years ago. But as you're uploading larger things, and these were like internal documents they wanted to share, they hit that limit. So this is another one. Again, if you can, if your hosting provider allows you, you can increase the file size limit. And it really depends too. Sometimes the file size limit is set, it could be in a couple of places. Your theme could actually control in the functions PHP, it could control the file size limit of your media library. But in general, it's a PHP thing. So it's your PHP ini, etc. If you're not so brave, so you can see this one has a 256 megabyte thing. If you're not brave enough to go in there and edit files yourselves, there are some plugins that may help you with it. I've tried this one before, the maximum upload file size. It generally worked. I did have one site though where even this plugin wasn't letting me make that change. So this is kind of a common one. It's annoying. This one, like I said, there's a couple of quick fixes to it. I think this is my last one I'm going to cover of a file type not permitted. So something you'll see on the WordPress side of things. So here in this example, it's a font, so a custom font from Adobe I was trying to upload. So the error message that you see is that the type is not permitted for security reasons. So WordPress itself has a list of file types that it allows you to upload to through the media library. And it prevents you from uploading anything because obviously it's trying to protect your site from people uploading malware and other things that shouldn't be loaded on your site. But one of the common things that people, we talked about this in the image presentation, Peter covered this last month, is SVG. So SVG files are better performing, they work better on websites, but the problem is they're not currently in that list of allowable file types. So if you want to use SVGs, you got to get around it, and you have to make a change either to WordPress itself to allow it to accept these file types. Simplest solution I've found, I don't know, Peter, if you have a better solution for this, but I'd rather do it with a plugin. So there's one plugin I've used called File Upload Types. So it lets you selectively choose which types you'll allow. Because the thing you don't want to do, I've seen some tutorials around this, you don't want to just say unfiltered. I mean, unfiltered basically,
Oh, God.
yeah, you can in WordPress, you can open it up in WP config and say, I don't care, just let anything go in there. Don't do that, so you want to be selective with this.
How many minutes will it take before your site is gone?
Yeah. Same thing with that unlimited file size thing. Don't go crazy because you're going to allow people to upload things that may break your site on the back end. So yeah, this one, like I said, I think is you may run into this, especially for custom fonts or SVG files.
Yeah, for specifically for SVG, I like Safe SVG or SVG support. Those are both. And what's nice about those is not only can you upload the file, they're checking. The issue with SVG is it's actually code. So the reason it needs to be scrubbed or at least made sure that nothing's hidden in that code, which is why like a Safe SVG or SVG support plugin works well. And then what's nice is then it works, that plugin will allow you to use an SVG like an image. It'll be in your media library. It'll be placeable. So yeah, I like it.
That was my quick list of common WordPress and ones and HTTP ones.
Let me. I'm going to lightning round some of the ones I've got. I'm going to take your ownership. Okay.
Yep.
Gotta make sure I'm grabbing the right.
And we're also going to send too, as part of this, like I said, we can't cover everything, but that Kinsta blog we keep referring to, that has a great list, and I think I've included that as a reference in the end, where it covers, I'd say, the majority of common things you're going to run into. So that's where a lot of the stuff is covered in more detail.
Yeah, exactly. This is oh no, that's a specific one. This is readily available or handy.
WP Beginner, I think, is the other one too that I put a link in for after.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so one of the things we didn't I don't think we covered yet, or if we did, I blanked out on it. But the basics of troubleshooting in WordPress, right? So something's going wrong. And there's sort of that kind of that, that first set of do these things, right? Clear your browser cache, clear your website's cache. It should be plural. I mean, possessive. And clearing the cache, making sure that how your site's being cached. Are you using a plugin that is caching your site, or is it maybe through managed hosting where you have a cache going? And so what happens when your cache is not cleared, you might make changes and then go look at your site and not see those changes and go, something's wrong, when really what's happened is you're remembering the old site, you haven't cleared your cache. So that's kind of the one of the standard things that you want to do when you're first fiddling and finding some problems, just making sure you clear your cache, clear the browser cache. Is your site updated? Looking for updates. Look for clues in the error messages, including on the plugin page where you get little alerts that kind of giving you some ideas of what's going on. Disable suspect plugins if there's an issue. That might be things like the most recent plugin you put in before all of a sudden something didn't work. There is the whole process of disable all plugins and restart, because you're looking for the any kind of conflict. And we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, as our final thoughts, but in asking for help and searching for help. I just want to make sure that we kind of got those in. And I don't know, Ray, is there things that we take for granted in terms of the?
No, I think that's part of it is also it's kind of with your clearing the cache too. As sites get more complicated now, for better or for worse, like CDN, that's a whole other topic in itself.
Yeah.
You may have multiple layers, so that's one thing. Is you don't need to be an expert of like understanding all the technical details, but knowing a little bit about how your site is architected. So for example, like some web hosting things, they're offering you CDN. So CDN is a content delivery network. They're offering it to you by just flipping a switch, which sounds great because it helps improve performance. But just be aware, a CDN is yet another cache of your site someplace.
Right.
So that could be really a problem. Sometimes you're like, wait a minute, why am I seeing an old version of this? It's, so understanding all those moving parts, I think is kind of key.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's exactly right. So I'm not going to go through a demonstration. I was going to break a site. We don't have the time for it, but it's really easy to do, just change one character in a file. But what'll happen when something like a plugin fails, or any kind of piece of code that WordPress is using to ultimately deliver the site. So it's talking to the database, it's using PHP, it's pulling your templates, and it's going, pulling your content, sending it through. If there's some piece of code along that path that can break the way things work, and that often can happen with a plugin failure. And sometimes the plugin failure, I had this situation with a particular host with certain plugins where the plugins were large. A lot of these are premium plugins with a whole lot of files to them. And what would happen is, whenever there was an update being done, not all the files would get moved over. And this would break the site because, the plugin that was looking for us didn't have all of its files. So, looking to see that, oh, wait a minute, and this was Toolset, which is a tool I like a lot, a plugins called Toolset, but I would get errors specific to Toolset. So it kind of give me, clue as to what, where that problem is. Then looking at, okay, well, let me disable that and look to say, okay, everything else is working except for maybe what, in this case, Toolset, was where that problem was. And then, if you can work on that one thing and get things working, sometimes it's just, the fixes we'll talk about, or, the reloading, rolling back if you have to, load through FTP, which is something that I had to do for this particular situation until I worked with the web hosting company to make sure that I could use the normal interface. I had to go through FTP. I had to download the full plugin. I had to unzip it. I had to go to FTP, and I had to upload all the files to the server to make that plugin work. So, being able to see, okay, that plugin's not work, or then when you get the issues of conflict you may have to disable and re-enable slowly to discover, oh, wait a minute, when this one and this one are on, there's a problem. You know, putting your site in maintenance mode or using that site health maintenance mode we didn't talk about. You can get a plugin that basically says, put a maintenance mode screen up saying, hey, we're working on the site. But that whole turning off plugins and then turning them back on, and I think for new users too, getting over the fact that you can disable a plugin and not worry that you've lost everything that plugin has done. Deleting it is a different story, because you could actually, depending on how it's set up, delete some of the data if it's putting data in database. But you're pretty safe disabling a plugin and then re-enabling it and having it go, you know, work fine. But yeah, so going through a process, determine what you need, remove what you, that whole remove what you don't need, you know, don't get caught into, I tried this, and all of a sudden you're looking at, I've got all these plugins that I don't use, even if they're, you know, inactive, get rid of them. If they're active and you don't use them, more's the reason to get rid of them, because you're just adding that much more code to your site that where you could run into some problems. Sometimes, you know, finding alternatives, you know, this plugin and that plugin, all things being equal, are the same, except for the fact that one breaks your site and the other one doesn't. You know, you sometimes have to do that kind of thing. That we mentioned the WP rollback as a plugin that allows you to kind of go back a version. I mentioned the reloading. Yeah, and if you're in a situation where you can use a staging site, that's even better, because you can test things before going live. There is a staging plugin. I have not used it, but it gets pretty high marks. Ray, do you know anyone who's used it?
No,
WP staging?
No,
Yeah.
I saw it mentioned as well too. No.
Yeah. So, you know, again, proceed with caution, but there are ways of like testing things before pushing them live. I just wanted to make sure that was put out there. The white screen of death and its variations we kind of talked about. I mentioned it's gotten much better. You know, what's nice is your site might be broken but still visible. You can get into the WordPress recovery mode. We don't have time to go into all of that, but that's the whole process of when you get that email and it's telling you what might be, you know, wrong. And again, looking for the clues, looking for the words within a URL that is telling you that you say, oh, wait a minute, I recognize that plugin by the name in the file that it's telling me isn't working. WordPress has gotten so much better with giving you some information that you can go in, find that and go, well, let me at least disable it so I can get my, you know, my site back to a certain point, or whatever the right process is for it. The nice thing is that your site might not even necessarily be down for other visitors, because WordPress is doing its best to deliver what it can while, you know, shutting down certain aspects of your site, or literally just saying, we turn this plugin off because it's broken. And you can go into your plugins list and you might find that that's in fact the case. And we mentioned the other ways to access your site, you know, gives you ways of getting at you know, the situations where you covered a lot of that.
Just to that point real quick
Yeah.
too. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, you know, again, is really important too, because if the only way you've ever accessed your site is through WP admin, you know, signing in, or WP login, whatever, to me, that's like, you know, once that site is broken, you can panic, because you're like, I don't know how else to troubleshoot. So, you know, file manager, like Peter's showing, FileZilla, I assume, is, I mean, this may be a little bit advanced for beginners, but at least understanding cPanel, going to file manager through cPanel, or whatever your hosted environment is, having the ability to look at the files, it can help, because behind the scenes, what I think Peter's shown here is you can disable plugins without being logged into WordPress. You can rename one of these directories. Don't delete. Again, if you rename a directory to like XXX or whatever you want to put it as, temporarily disabled, that's the same thing as disabling a plugin. So I would say, just, you know, if you're running your own website, make sure that you've at least signed in once to cPanel, you're hosting it, etc., just to get familiar with how you can get access to your files, because that's like having a spare key to your website.
Yep, exactly. So, you know, here's a quick one that I've seen. I actually saw this very recently, where the advice that was being given through a Facebook group, not ours, was bad. And I was going to talk about that a little bit at the end, you know, where you can get some help. And be careful where you go, because some people think that Elementor is the answer to everything. No editorializing here, already did. So, you know, in this particular case, there's a problem where you can get stuck in maintenance mode. So what happens is, for the seconds that you're uploading a new theme or updating a theme or a plugin, your site will briefly go into maintenance mode because basically some of those files might be, not available or, in the process. And it usually happens very, very quickly. If you've got larger things, like I mentioned, larger plugins, I might go to that site, or you might see it sometimes when you go to update something and then you go to look at, well, what had changed, and all of a sudden, even on your local screen, it said site's not available. Problem is when it stays that way. So that message that will pop up on the screen and very often never be seen, called briefly unavailable for scheduled maintenance, check back in a minute. Sometimes it gets stuck. And quite honestly, what happens is when it goes into maintenance mode, a little file gets created called .maintenance in the root of your website. And just finding if that's the case, and this is where if you're in this case FTP and you go to the root of your site, typically it's a public HTML, and you find, if you happen to have .maintenance file there and you delete it, your site will come back. Now, you want to do that when all of a sudden you realize that, a few minutes later, 10 minutes later or something, that you've got this problem. But there's an example of fixing a site because something just glitched. Here's what's happening. You can safely remove that file. Your site's back up. It's not a panic mode. It's not anything huge. We already talked a little bit of very briefly, and I think we've talked about this in some other meetups. But when you get that the site's not secure, there's no padlock, there's warnings about mixed or unsecure site. That Why No Padlock plugin is great for giving you some hope. But I'll tell you, the new WordPress that came out in the last few days has a one-click HTTP to HTTPS fix, and this fix does do, as I understand it, I haven't had the need to use it, but it does go through your database and make sure that if you have an image that is using HTTP and it's on your server and you have HTTPS, it will fix that. So instead of using simple SSL or anything like that, WordPress now has built in the ability to fix HTTPS issues if they're of that nature that it's just something is is using the wrong protocol as a file. And then of course you may need to work on it if the host work with the host if the certificate itself is invalid. I mean, obviously there's things that go well beyond it's at the domain level versus WordPress. We kind of talked a little briefly too with some of the tools, but content errors where you've got broken links or images not loading, the CSS not loading. You might see that in that waterfall if you go to GTmetrix or on the inspector, where you're all of a sudden saying that a CSS files now is otherwise missing. I've seen this sometimes happen when people are using a plugin that minifies or combines some of these things, and maybe something glitches on that, and a file doesn't work, and it may be as simple as disabling the plugin that is affecting your CSS. But knowing that there are ways to test what isn't showing, and then so that ultimately you can go in and find out why, is at least having some of these tools where you can look.
Hey, Peter,
Yep.
So one quick, because I think I actually missed it. I had it in my notes of our outline, but it kind of going back to content ones, as more people are using page builders, again, I'm Divi or Elementor, that was supposed to be my slide in there too. I forgot about it. Is you may now start encountering issues where it's not really your website that's broken. It's when you're making a change in the back end, your page builder itself is having issues. So for example, Divi and Elementor, these other ones, they can be resource hogs, because they're running some JavaScript framework in the back end. So I'm sure Steve has seen this a couple of times too, where if you're trying to save something, all of a sudden maybe it's your page builder that really becomes unresponsive or is very slow, or et cetera. So in a lot of those cases, it's one of those, it's a timing thing. Sometimes you just need to refresh the page, get out of your page builder, get baback in, log out, log back in, all the kind of basic things. So don't panic too much with that, but that's sometimes on a back end thing where if you're working on a page and it looks all screwed up, it could be your page builder itself, not WordPress. So you might be the only
Yep.
person seeing it, not your visitors. So I just want to throw that in real quick.
Yeah, no, that's good. And you know, there is that decades old tech debugging solution. Did you turn it off and back on again? And it does.
For printers, that's all the time.
And it does apply to certain things, especially with page builders, and what is happening in the memory of the browser.
Yeah.
With JavaScript and all, sometimes it's just a matter of close it, clear your cache, come back in, everything works fine. You know, so you know, again, that problem may not be a problem, or it's a temporary problem based on something happening, you know, with the browser itself, and not even anything to do with your website. You know, briefly, right? Avoiding the errors. We talk about this all the time. Keep your site backed up. Keep your site updated. You know, get quality hosting. A lot of problems can happen because of honestly bad hosting. I'm dealing with 3 folks right now who are using hosting that is just not delivering their site, and it could be as simple as got to move the site. Is, you know, so that's important to know. The quality themes and plugins, and yeah, how do you know it's a quality theme and plugin? We could spend some time at it, but you know, they're looking at something that you know has a good user base, a strong support structure, well known. Is gonna get you pretty far. Uninstall what you don't need. Keep your database tidy. That enters into, you know, there are tools for cleaning up your database, but that could be, again, as simple as, you know, delete what you don't need, even if it's just the plugins. You know, sometimes cleaning up even old content. And like I said, maybe we'll do some database stuff in another time, but you know, getting into that issue of keeping that database. And I think this goes into, you know, some of our final thoughts. You want to cover anything other than?
I don't think. Let me check real quick what I had in the slide.
Okay.
Final thoughts. Let me share it real quick.
And please, I know we're really, you know, we're in the last minutes.
I think I basically have the same. Yeah, I mean, again, we'll send out the links to these resources. Some is again, once you're able to actually get an error code, whether it's through logs or however, you know, the means Google. Yeah, I hate to say it's taken over all of our brains, but you know, 9 times out of 10, if you're, you know, if you're putting the right keywords in there, the right error description, somebody has either written an article about it or there's somebody's answered it before. So, you know, that's the hardest part. It's not finding out how to fix it usually. Again, this, I think maybe Peter will cover the careful what your resources are. You know, he's talked about this many times before. You know, if you're finding an error solution that's 5 years old, you know, take that with a grain of salt, because things may have changed quite a bit. But in general, you know.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times, you know, and people get really, really frustrated. They get angry. They say WordPress is the worst thing in the world because they're looking at a 4-year-old YouTube tutorial video that doesn't apply to anything that they're doing. But honestly, you know, in their defense, they don't know that it doesn't apply because they don't have that basis. That's why, you know, when I could do a whole thing on helping folks, you know, make sure when you're doing Google and do a date filter on it, you know, only show me things in the last 6 months or years. Same thing with YouTube, you know, just make sure that you're looking at the stuff that applies to your situation. I think is huge. You'll save yourself a lot of pain by doing searches that are gonna be that much closer to what you need.
I know we covered a lot, just like our last image one, but part of this was hopefully people have come away with some ideas and now a list of resources and tools around, you know, when you do have a problem, like we said, don't panic. There's plenty of tools out there. Some of it is just, you know, pinpointing the areas you need to investigate. So hopefully between a lot of stuff Peter mentioned, some of, you know, back to those 5 tips, a lot of times that's all you need to do is, you know, turn off a plugin, whatever. And you know, from a WordPress standpoint, fortunately, you know, when the problem is in the WordPress space, it's a lot easier to solve. Where things get tricky is when you start getting deeper into those layers that I was showing you, the hosting problems, the database problems. That's where you really need to pull in some more expert support. But hopefully, we've given you some ideas of, you know, between looking at log files, things like that, where you can get the additional error information and then hand that off to the real experts afterwards. So I know we're kind of winding down on time, and we always fill in a lot of time. And I think what we want to also mention to people too is when you may not have a problem right now. I hope you didn't come to this because your site's down. Because you should have brought that up in the beginning. We could have
Exactly. We said, are there any questions?
But if you do have problems in the future, we'll send out obviously the recording, a link to the recording. It'll be on our YouTube channel, but come to the Facebook page. I mean, we can't solve everyone's problems, but I think between the tools that we have, the experience we have, and all the brain power, both on this webinar as well as in the Facebook group, we can help you out. Like I said, there is help, and hopefully we've given you at least some ideas of the common problems you're likely to encounter. Any other final thoughts, Peter? Any other words of wisdom?
No, I was looking at the chat. If somebody has anything specific based on, or what we talked about, or that they are dealing with, somebody asked any wisdom on allowing someone else to access a Gmail account. Well, I think that goes into the whole topic of when.
I think it's a don't.
Huh?
Jim's answer was don't.
Don't, yeah, no, and that's a good valid answer. But there are times when you do need to get a developer, looking at your site, and there is, I don't honestly, I can't think of any reason why somebody would need a Gmail account. But being able to get into WordPress, having some control, making sure one, are they trusted? Are you setting up a user account that you can have control over? Those types of things. So sometimes you have to do that. People trust Ray and I all the time to be able to go into their sites, and we tread safely.
It was my question. It's to do with a high school reunion. And so far I've done 99% of the work, and I don't want to do any more. So I want to pass off some responsibility.
I would say one thing, maybe it's not specific to Gmail, but this is kind of covered in some of our security discussions, is whenever you're giving somebody access to a site or a website or whatever, give them the least amount of least role for what they need to do. So back to Peter's thing about administrators. I've seen a lot of sites where there's people on there that are, everyone's an admin, and I would ask them, as a site person, what is this person doing? Oh, they're posting blog posts. They don't need an admin to do that. So
yeah, absolutely. As far as sharing work, sometimes it depends on how you set things up, but setting up a Gmail account is pretty easy to do, and setting up a separate one that you do a group share, or if all your documents are in a Google Drive or things like that. So there's certainly ways of sharing information without, if things are tied to your personal account, you don't want to share that. But if there are plenty of ways to get groups of people kind of sharing information.
Especially if everyone's in the Google ecosystem, if they have Gmail accounts, like you said, there's a lot of, you can share basically almost anything, documents, files, etc.
Yeah, I use the whole Google Docs, Google Drive for so much now.
I was just talking about, we done a talk on Inspector. If you mean Chrome Inspect, I think I did one. I did one, like a deep dive about using Chrome Inspect. I don't know I assume we were.
I don't know if that might have been, we'll have to check to see if that might have been
the YouTube channel. I think it's
yeah.
Hey guys, I have a random question for you.
All right, we'll make up an answer.
Okay, good. I can swear that when I was poking around WordPress way back in the beginning, I found a setting for where you can launch external URLs in a separate window versus replacing your current window.
Yep.
And I had a need for that all of a sudden, and I was going back and trying to find that. I couldn't locate it. You guys know where that setting is?
It's not in WordPress. I thought.
Well,
it would have been in my theme.
No, it's related to an SEO plugin. Yoast will do it, Rank Math will do it, All-in-One will do it, but it's not native to WordPress and hasn't been in some time.
Right.
Okay. All right. I'll check my
you
SEO
can do it
plugin.
You can definitely do it on a URL by URL basis. There's a, in the block editor, there's a little toggle switch that says open in a new window. Then you get into the whole topic. So then you get the SEO versus accessibility, for example. So in the world of accessibility, opening up new windows is not considered best practice for the most part, because you're taking control away from the visitor, but that's a different topic. But yeah.
Okay, this is when I'm hosting someone else's content and they want to link back to their site, but I don't want to close my site.
Got it. Yeah.
Time. Yeah.
I mean, from an
Thanks.
SEO standpoint, the other thing we didn't cover, obviously because we can't cover everything, is back to like broken links. The other tool I thought you were going to have in your list, Peter, was the what is it, the redirection.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So the nice thing about that, even if you're not doing redirects necessarily, it does have the ability to log errors. So you can log your 404 errors. So just over time, if you know something comes up where something's broken, you can immediately create a redirect for that. So that's another nice one from an SEO standpoint.
Yeah, no, redirection is a plugin I use a lot, and I'll even use it. So here's an example of using it. I've used it to fix errors that are not WordPress related, but might be the customer shared the wrong URL to something. And it was a quick way to make sure that the URL still worked because it redirected. So it's literally a from here, go there. But again, as Ray said, it also, in terms of error and debugging, it'll tell you if you've got, all of a sudden you go, wait a minute, why is everybody trying to go to this one link that doesn't exist? And, you know, one, let me be aware of it. And two, you know, let me make sure that it doesn't deliver a bad experience. Did you see that? Are you looking at the chat, Ray?
Yeah, I was just replying back to Mike's question. So Mike, about like IT infrastructure and all that. I mean, in my opinion, I mean, a lot of that, you know, because WordPress has, I mean, it's a good thing. WordPress is used by a lot less technical people now. In a lot of ways, WordPress itself, even installing WordPress, I mean, like locally, we talk about local by Flywheel and all that. It's so much easier to install it. And I mean, thank goodness. You know, so because of that, I think just like from an infrastructure standpoint, these days, it seems like a lot of things are deferred to your hosting company. So, you know, if there's real infrastructure problem related to WordPress, I think it'd be tough if you're trying to carve that out as a niche for yourself, unless you want to work for a hosting company or something. But yeah, I think most people these days tend to defer that to their hosting company.
And the sort of work that I would do is the kind of troubleshooting I would do, or the at a high level, or the kind of things that you're talking about here. So I wondered if people have trouble doing that, maybe I might be easier for me.
Well, yeah, no, there's definitely a market for the, you know, I will help you on an ad hoc basis for an amount of time. Whether it is, there's plenty of people get to a point and they're like, can I just pay you to fix my site? And a lot of people have made a career out of doing just that kind of thing, where it's you schedule appointments and have them come in, and you know, if you need them long-term maintenance and things like that. But oh yeah, there's definitely opportunity in the support. It is the most popular platform on the web, so that's a good thing.
There's also still infrastructure companies that are handling, you know, as you probably know, IT infrastructure for, you know, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and a lot of the small, medium-sized businesses do have WordPress sites. So I can see, like, if you're going down that route, maybe it's get in touch with some of these, like, you know, IT support companies, and there's quite a few even in Connecticut too. Like, talk to them and say, hey, my expertise is WordPress support. You know, that's maybe a way in.
You touched on one thing. I think on another meetup, we'll talk a little bit about hosting as a sub thing. I have really come to. I love Cloudways. I've recently discovered it. I can spin up a website in minutes. It's great. It's so, but as a you know, a cloud web hosting company, it's great. So there's a lot of opportunities with how even hosting itself has evolved.
So I think we're at the top of the hour now, so I like to be respectful of people's time, and we'll end it here. Like I said, I know we covered a lot, so we'll be sending out the information afterwards, a link to the recording, which, like I said, will be on our YouTube channel probably the next day or so, and the slides, and Peter's wiki link. We'll send out a link.
Yeah, we'll
I like that.
Ray and I will work on kind of combining these things, and maybe I think it becomes its own self-recording thing. The WordPress, the Hartford WordPress Facebook group. We mentioned a number of times, but Ray and I are monitoring it all the time, and ask questions there. It's a nice small group. So if we can't help you, we'll point in the right direction, or to a fault, we sometimes do the research. I know I do, to figure out, because I like to learn myself.
I hate to say it, I like debugging too. That was always my thing as a software developer. I know it's weird, but I enjoy it. It's like problem solving, And if you look at it that way, it's like you're solving a puzzle. So
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you very
Take care,
much for
guys.
joining us. Have a good night. We'll see you hopefully next week at our next meetup.
Good night, everybody.
Hey, Sly.